If you ever look at my phone again, I will tell the police you hit me." Mora shoved her hand against my chest, the heel of her palm striking my breastbone hard. Her acrylic nails, painted a harsh, glossy crimson, dug violently into my skin through the thin cotton of my t-shirt. She twisted her wrist just enough to scrape downward, and I felt the sudden, sharp sting of broken flesh as three distinct trails of fire dragged across my collarbone. I was 28 years old. I was standing on the freezing hardwood floor of our kitchen, in just my boxers and a worn-out shirt, the icy drafts of a bitter Denver winter seeping through the poor insulation of the baseboards and radiating up my calves. The house was dead quiet, save for the low, mechanical hum of the refrigerator compressor kicking on and the harsh rattle of the wind against the window panes. I stood there, shivering from the ambient cold and the adrenaline dumping into my bloodstream, staring at the woman I had spent 6 years loving. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, her pupils dilated. The air between us smelled of stale vodka, spearmint chewing gum, and a heavy floral perfume that clung to her clothes, a perfume I hadn't bought for her. I didn't care about the text messages I'd just seen light up her locked screen on the kitchen island. A message from a number saved only as an emoji, reading, "Still thinking about what you did in the shower." They were just confirmation of what I already suspected, another drop of water in an already overflowing bucket. The real weapon, the thing currently anchoring me to reality, was the piece of paper crumpled tightly in my left fist. My knuckles were stark white. The paper was a DNA test result. I hadn't taken it to catch her in a lie. I wasn't looking for ghosts where there were none. I'd taken it 3 weeks prior for a bone marrow registry drive because a buddy of mine from the local lumberyard had been diagnosed with aggressive leukemia. Since I was already doing the cheek swab kit at the clinic, I'd swabbed our 3-year-old son, Leo, at the exact same time. The doctor had suggested it casually, just to see if the boy carried the same rare HLA blood marker I did, in case he ever wanted to be on the registry when he was older. The automated email from the genetic lab had hit my inbox at 2:14 a.m. The boy sleeping upstairs in the room I had painted. The boy I had rocked through every spiking fever, every terrifying night terror, every single night of his life. The boy whose tiny fingers I had kissed and whose scraped knees I had bandaged shared 0% of my DNA. My heart was currently pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, a heavy, sickening thud that I could feel in my throat. Bile rose in the back of my mouth, hot and acidic. But Mora didn't know I was holding those results. She couldn't see the paper hidden in the shadow of my clenched fist. She thought this was just another argument about her stumbling through the front door at 3 in the morning, reeking of alcohol and deceit. She had absolutely no idea what was coming for her. My name is Torin. I'm a quiet guy. I always have been. If you saw me walking down the street, you probably wouldn't look twice. I wear faded, thick flannel shirts that smell faintly of pine sap, heavy denim jeans stained with dark wood finish, and scuffed work boots. I drive a 10-year-old heavy-duty truck that rattles violently in the steering column when it hits 40 miles an hour. I spend most of my days covered in a fine layer of sawdust, my hands perpetually calloused and rough. I'm an antique dealer and restorer here in Denver, Colorado. I buy broken, discarded things, Victorian chairs with shattered, splintered legs, mid-century dressers with peeling, water-damaged veneer, grandfather clocks with rusted gears that haven't ticked in decades. I haul them back to my dusty workshop, and I spend hundreds of hours bringing them back to life. That job requires a very specific, deeply ingrained kind of mindset. You can't rush restoration. If you pull a loose joint too hard, the dry wood splinters into useless shards. If you apply the sandpaper too fast or with too much pressure, you permanently ruin the natural grain. If you apply the varnish before the stain has truly set, The finish turns cloudy and ruined. You have to sit there on your stool, breathing in the sharp, chemical tang of linseed oil and mineral spirits, quiet and entirely focused, and let the piece dictate the pace. You have to be infinitely patient. You have to endure the tedium. That patience? That finely honed ability to sit in total, suffocating silence and wait for the absolute right moment to strike the chisel. It's the only reason I'm not currently sitting in a concrete prison cell. I grew up hard. My dad wasn't around. He walked out when I was 4, leaving nothing but a closet full of empty hangers and a stack of unpaid bills. My mom worked 3 grueling jobs, waitressing, cleaning hotel rooms, and stocking shelves on the night shift, just to keep the rattling radiators hissing with heat in our tiny, drafty 2-bedroom apartment. I practically raised my younger sister, making sure her backpack was zipped, making sure she got on the yellow bus, making sure she ate the cheap boxed macaroni I learned to cook on a faulty stove when I was 8 years old. I learned early on that complaining didn't fix a broken pipe, and crying didn't put food in the pantry. Action fixed things. Silent, relentless endurance fixed things. My grandfather was the one who taught me how to work with my hands. He was a tough, unyielding old guy, a diesel mechanic who smelled perpetually of motor oil and smoked unfiltered Pall Mall cigarettes down to the absolute nub. He rarely spoke more than 10 words a day, but when he did speak, his voice was like gravel grinding under a boot, and you listened. He had this one specific saying he'd repeat whenever I was a teenager, throwing my tools down in frustrated anger over a stubborn piece of warped oak I couldn't get to lay flat. He would place his heavy, grease-stained hand on my shoulder, squeeze until I stopped breathing so hard, and say, "A loud dog barks at the thief and scares him into the woods, but a quiet dog remembers his scent, tracks him to his den, and ends the problem." I didn't fully understand the terrifying depth of what he meant until I was 28, standing in my freezing kitchen, bleeding from my own wife's manicured fingernails. I noticed things, small things, microscopic shifts in reality, the kind of things self-absorbed people think absolutely nobody sees. I notice when someone's breathing rhythm changes from relaxed to defensive. I notice the micro expressions of guilt that flash across a face for a fraction of a second before the fake smile returns. I notice when a ceramic coffee cup is placed on the left side of the sink instead of the right, indicating it was placed there in a hurry. I notice the exact, sharp scent of an unfamiliar laundry detergent on a jacket that hasn't been washed in our home's machines. That one thing about me? That quiet, deeply obsessive observation? It's the reason this story has the ending it does. But to understand how we got to that freezing night in the kitchen, to understand the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, you need to know how the trap was meticulously set over the course of 3 agonizing years. I met Maura at a crowded, independent coffee shop on Colfax Avenue. It was mid-April. It was raining outside, one of those sudden, aggressive, blinding Denver downpours that turns the streets to rivers in minutes. The air inside the shop was thick with the smell of roasted espresso beans, damp wool sweaters, and melting pastries. She had sprinted inside to escape the deluge, laughing loudly, completely soaked. Rainwater dripped from her dark hair onto the hardwood floor. She was electric. That's the only word that fits. She had this bright, chaotic, undeniable energy that acted like a gravitational pull, drawing the eyes of everyone in the room. I was sitting quietly in the back corner booth, nursing a black, bitter coffee, my one steadfast daily ritual, and reading a heavy, leather-bound book on 18th century joinery techniques. She didn't look where she was going. She practically crashed into my small wooden table, her hip catching the edge. My ceramic mug tipped over, spilling half my scalding black coffee across the table and onto the edge of my book. Instead of apologizing, instead of grabbing a napkin, she just looked at the mess, tossed her wet hair back, and laughed. A bright, bell-like sound. "Well," she said, her eyes dancing with amusement. "Looks like you needed waking up anyway." I slowly picked up my mug, grabbing a napkin to dab at the soaked pages. I think my book absorbed most of the wake-up call. She leaned over, squinting at the title, entirely unbothered by my ruined property. "Oh, 18th century joinery? Yeah, I definitely did you a favor. That looks like a prescribed cure for insomnia." "I'm Mora." I looked up at her, taken aback by her sheer audacity. "Torin, and it's actually pretty interesting." She rolled her eyes playfully, leaning her hands on my table. "Lie to me if you want, Torin. But are you going to buy me a vanilla latte to make up for being in my collision path?" I stared at her, genuinely confused. "You spilled my coffee, ruined my page, and I'm buying?" "It's the gentlemanly thing to do." She smiled, a brilliant, blinding flash of white teeth. "Plus, I left my wallet in my car, and I am freezing." I should have recognized the glaring, crimson-red flag right there. The complete and utter lack of consideration for others, expertly masked as quirky, spontaneous charm. Looking back, the warning was right there, flashing neon in the dim light of the cafe. I chose to see it as spontaneity. I chose to be charmed. For the first 2 years, it was incredible. We were the opposite ends of a powerful magnet. She pulled me aggressively out of my comfortable shell, dragging me to loud, sweaty indie rock concerts downtown, making me try bizarre, spicy foods from dimly lit food trucks at midnight. We'd sit on the cold metal hood of my truck in the foothills, eating cold carnitas tacos, looking up at the sprawling canopy of stars over the jagged peaks of the Rockies. I felt a warmth in my chest I had never known. I genuinely, deeply believed I had found my person. We got married fast, 14 months after the coffee shop. "Too fast," my mom said, her eyes full of quiet worry as she helped me adjust my tie on the wedding day. But I didn't listen. I was blinded by the light Mora gave off. Then she got pregnant. The pregnancy was rough, filled with complaints and resentment about her changing body, but I catered to her every whim. Then Leo was born. The exact moment I stood in that harsh, fluorescent-lit hospital room, wearing a blue paper gown, and held that tiny, screaming, fragile kid against my chest, something inside my core permanently, violently shifted. I smelled the sweet, milky scent of his skin. I felt the impossibly tiny weight of him. I loved him with a primal ferocity that actually terrified me. My heart no longer belonged to me. It beat outside my chest, wrapped in a swaddle. I would have gladly stepped in front of a speeding freight train to keep him from getting a paper cut. Mora, though. Mora changed. Or rather, the mask slipped. I told myself it was postpartum depression. I read books on it. I told myself she was just adjusting to the massive hormonal shifts and the loss of her absolute freedom. But as Leo grew from a helpless infant into a walking, babbling toddler, her behavior didn't soften. It crystallized. It hardened into something cold and sharp. It started with small, insidious things. The phone going immediately face down on the granite kitchen counter with a sharp clack whenever I walked into the room. I remember the exact moment the seed of doubt was planted. We were at Marco's, a little dimly lit Italian place we loved, celebrating our 3rd anniversary. The air smelled beautifully of roasted garlic, rich marinara, and melting mozzarella. The restaurant was filled with the ambient clatter of silverware and low conversation. She had been staring down at her lap, her thumbs flying across her screen under the table for 20 minutes. She hadn't heard a word I'd said about the new workshop lease. When the waiter suddenly appeared over her shoulder to bring our plates of veal, she panicked. She slapped the phone face down onto the white linen tablecloth so fast and so hard she knocked over her crystal water glass. Ice water flooded across the table, soaking into the bread basket. I grabbed my napkin, tossing it over the spill. "Who is so urgent?" I asked, keeping my voice light, though a tight knot was forming in my stomach. She looked up at me. The vibrant, dancing eyes from the coffee shop were gone. They were completely flat, dark, and hostile. "Chloe," she snapped. "Why? Are you monitoring my screen time now?" "No," I said, my throat tightening slightly. "Just asking. It's our anniversary dinner. You've been texting the entire time." "And I'm here, aren't I?" She shot back, crossing her arms. "She's having a massive crisis with her boyfriend. She needs me." "You've been typing paragraphs. Is she okay?" "She's fine, Torin," she sighed, an exaggerated expulsion of air. "God, you're so suffocating sometimes. Can I not have a social life just because I'm a mother?" I told myself it was nothing. I swallowed the lump in my throat and ate my food. It tasted like ash. It wasn't nothing. Then came the new, complex, alphanumeric passwords on all her devices. Then the iPad I used to use for reading the news was suddenly locked down. Then came the sudden, unexplainable need for girls' weekends, where she would drive up to the mountains with Chloe and go completely dark for 12, sometimes 18 hours at a time. "My battery died," she would say breezily, walking into the house on a Sunday afternoon. She would walk past me, completely ignoring Leo reaching his little arms up for a hug. And as she passed, the air would shift. She smelled like a brand of expensive, musky sandalwood soap we didn't own, and her hair always looked freshly blown out. "You should really get a portable charger," I would suggest quietly. "Stop being so paranoid, Torin," she would snap from the stairs. "It's suffocating. You're acting like a warden." The real fracture, the exact moment the glass cracked and I felt the jagged edge of it slice into my stomach, happened on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in mid-August. I had come home 3 hours early from the shop because a wealthy client had abruptly canceled a consultation. The house was dead quiet, too quiet. The air conditioning was humming, but there was no sound of cartoons, no sound of toys clattering. I walked upstairs, still wearing my dusty work boots, and pushed open the door to Leo's nursery. He was 2 years old at the time. He was standing in his crib, gripping the wooden rails so hard his knuckles were white. He was completely soaked in his own urine, the sharp, acidic smell burning my nostrils the second I entered. He was crying so hard his little face was mottled purple, his chest heaving with desperate, jagged gasps. His voice was a thin, hoarse rasp, the sound of a child who had been screaming for hours until his vocal cords gave out. I panicked. A cold wash of terror flooded my veins. I thought Maura must have fallen down the stairs, or had a seizure, or gotten hurt. I scooped his trembling, soaked body into my arms, staining my shirt, and ran through the upstairs hallway, screaming her name. "Maura! Maura!" I ran down the stairs, my heavy boots thudding against the wood. I checked the kitchen, the living room, the half bath. Empty. Then I looked out the glass sliding door. I found her out on the back patio. The Colorado sun was beating down, blindingly bright. She was lying on a padded lounge chair wearing a bikini. She had noise-canceling headphones wedged into her ears. She was holding a tall glass of crisp white wine, the condensation dripping down her wrist. She was sunbathing, scrolling through her phone and laughing out loud at something on her screen. I slammed my hand against the sliding glass door, shoving it open on its tracks. The sudden noise and the faint, hoarse wail of Leo's crying finally reached her. She pulled one earbud out, squinting at me against the sun. She didn't jump up. She didn't drop her phone. She just rolled her eyes, a look of profound annoyance crossing her features. "What?" she asked lazily. "Mora, he's soaked through," I said, my voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of fear and rising anger. "He's been screaming his lungs out. Where were you?" "Can you get him?" she asked, looking back down at her screen. "He's been whining all afternoon. It's giving me a splitting migraine." "How long has he been crying?" I demanded, stepping out onto the hot concrete. "I don't know. 20 minutes?" She lied smoothly. "I had my pods in. I need a break too, you know. I work hard." "He's purple, Mora. He's dehydrated. He needs a bath immediately." "So give him one," she snapped, taking a slow sip of her wine. "That's what a father is for, isn't it? Stop hovering over me trying to make me feel guilty and go take care of your kid." My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. The coldness in her voice wasn't just casual neglect. It wasn't exhaustion. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the patio chair into the pool like I wanted to. I just turned around, walked back inside, went upstairs and ran the warm water in the tub. I sat on the edge of the porcelain tub, bathing my son. I felt the warm water slide over his shivering shoulders. I lathered the sweet-smelling lavender baby shampoo into his hair. Slowly, his jagged breathing leveled out. He finally stopped crying, letting out a long, exhausted sigh, and rested his little wet head heavily against my chest, his tiny fingers gripping my shirt. As I sat there holding him, a quiet, terrifying thought bloomed in the dark corners of my mind. A thought I could no longer suppress. She doesn't love him, and she doesn't love me. She is entirely empty. And that was the night, after she had passed out in bed, that I crept into the kitchen and checked her iPad, which she had drunkenly forgotten to lock. What I found, I still can't say the exact words out loud without my hands shaking and my jaw clenching until my teeth ache. The texts were to a group chat with Chloe and two other women. The messages weren't just about other men. That wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was how much she enjoyed the cruelty. She mocked my clothes. She mocked my income. She complained about Leo being a leech on her youth. She bragged about how easy it was to manipulate me because I was so desperate for a family. From that day on, I stopped trying to win her back. I shifted into survival mode, and the escalation from her side became relentless. It was as if, having internally decided she was done with the marriage, she wanted to actively punish me for still existing within it. The disrespect started bleeding out into public. Beat one was the dinner party. We were at a high-end steakhouse downtown, attending a dinner with her friends from her luxury real estate office. The room was loud, smelling of charred meat and expensive red wine. I was sitting quietly at the edge of the large, circular table, wearing my best suit, trying to blend into the upholstery. I was listening to them loudly debate commercial property values when her friend Chloe, sitting across from me, leaned forward. "So, Torin," Chloe said, her voice dripping with condescension, "how is the little antique business going? Finding any hidden treasures in the trash?" Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Mora let out a loud, theatrical sigh that cut through the noise of the restaurant. "Oh, please, Chloe, Torin doesn't run a real business," Mora said, swirling her Cabernet in her massive glass. "He plays in a dusty, freezing garage with garbage that other people threw away. It's a cute hobby that barely pays the electric bill." She paused, making sure everyone at the table was looking at her. "But you know Torin," she continued, her voice taking on a vicious, mocking lilt. "He doesn't feel ambition like normal men. He's exactly like a piece of his old, useless furniture. He just sits there in the corner, totally silent, collecting dust. The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Everyone awkwardly looked down at their expensive plates of food. Chloe smirked, hiding her smile behind her wine glass. I felt a sudden, intense flush of heat rise in my neck, burning my collar. I looked across the table at Mora. She stared right back at me, a hard, glittering, challenging glint in her dark eyes. She was daring me to snap. She was begging me to cause a scene so she could play the victim of an angry, unstable husband. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs. I channeled my grandfather. "I like the dust," I said quietly, my voice perfectly level. I picked up my fork, cut a piece of my steak, and took a bite. "It's peaceful." That infuriated her. My absolute refusal to fight back, my refusal to give her the drama she craved, drove her insane. So she pushed harder. Beat 2 was control. Specifically, territorial control of my sanctuary. I had a small 10 by 10 home office on the ground floor. It was my only space in the house. I kept my restoration logs, my accounting books, my delicate finishing supplies, and my grandfather's antique, hand-forged steel tools in there. One evening in late October, I came home from picking up Leo at daycare. It was already dark, the wind howling outside. I walked to the office to put my ledger away, and the brass doorknob wouldn't turn. It was locked with a new deadbolt. I walked into the kitchen. Mora was standing at the island, tossing a salad, wearing expensive new yoga pants. "Why's the office locked?" I asked, setting Leo down on the rug. "It's my private yoga and meditation space now," she said, not looking up from her bowl. "I need an area with good energy." "All my client files are in there," I said, stepping closer. "My grandfather's tools are in there. I had movers come this afternoon. They put all your junk in the basement," she replied, stabbing a cherry tomato with her fork. The basement was an unfinished, dirt floor nightmare. It was damp, prone to mold, and it regularly flooded with 2 inches of standing water during heavy rain. "Mora, the moisture down there will permanently rust my grandfather's tools," I said, my voice tightening, my hands curling into fists at my sides. "The humidity will warp the paper logs." She finally looked up, her eyes cold and dead. "Then you should have made enough money to buy us a house with a finished waterproof basement," she snapped viciously. "I need a space to breathe in this house. You take up entirely too much space, Torin. Just you existing near me disturbs my peace." I didn't scream. I turned around, opened the basement door, and was hit with the musty, mildewed stench of wet earth. I spent 4 agonizing hours that night, my lower back screaming in pain, carrying heavy steel anvils, iron clamps, and boxes of delicate paper logs up the narrow wooden stairs, out the front door, and into the freezing bed of my truck. I covered them with a heavy waterproof tarp. As I tied down the bungee cords, the icy wind biting my face, I looked up at the kitchen window. She was standing there, bathed in the warm yellow light, drinking a glass of wine, just watching me suffer. Then came beat 3, the replacement. It wasn't a confirmed, undeniable affair yet. It was just the arrogant, sloppy ghost of one. I started noticing the distinct, sharp smell of men's cologne lingering heavily in the passenger seat fabric of her SUV whenever I had to move it out of the driveway so I could leave for work. It wasn't my soap. It was a sharp, cheap, metallic scent that smelled like aerosol body spray and arrogance. Then, I found a crumpled, grease-stained receipt in the kitchen trash can. It was for 2 expensive coffees and 2 pastries at a boutique cafe across town, 30 miles in the opposite direction of her real estate office. It was time-stamped for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. When I calmly confronted her about it, holding the receipt in my hand, she gaslighted me with terrifying Olympic-level skill. What is this? She laughed, snatching the paper from my hand. Are you digging through the garbage now? Torin, you are losing your mind. It's 30 miles away, Mora. You said you were at the office all day. Who was in the passenger seat? A client, she yelled, throwing her hands up. I was showing a commercial property. You're seeing shadows, Torin. You're getting intensely paranoid and controlling. It's actually really unattractive. It's creepy. No wonder I don't want to sleep with you anymore. You act like a stalker. I felt a twisting sensation of nausea in my gut. I didn't know it then, but this specific habit of hers, accusing me of being mentally unstable while actively, purposefully destroying my reality, would be the exact mechanism that sealed her fate. Beat 4 was the public humiliation, the physical escalation. It was the 4th of July. The neighborhood was sweltering. We were attending a backyard barbecue hosted by our next-door neighbors, the Gables. Mrs. Gable was a sweet, sharp-eyed older woman who always baked fresh chocolate chip cookies for Leo and waved at me every morning. Her husband was a retired Denver homicide detective. Mora had been drinking strong tequila margaritas since noon. She was holding court by the edge of the sparkling blue pool, wearing a designer yellow sundress, laughing loudly and obnoxiously with Chloe and a few other younger women from the neighborhood. I was kneeling on the hot grass, wrestling with a squirming Leo, trying to rub sticky white coconut sunscreen onto his shoulders. I finished, patted his head, and stood up. I noticed Mora's expensive sunglasses lying in the grass near my foot. I picked them up and walked over to hand them to her. You dropped these, I said quietly. As I extended my hand, a kid ran past us, bumping my calf. I stumbled slightly. My elbow bumped Mora's shoulder. A tiny, microscopic splash of her lime margarita spilled over the rim of her glass and landed on her wrist. It was an accident. A complete, undeniable, split-second accident. Mora spun around, her face instantly twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. Her eyes went wide and dark, and before I could even open my mouth to apologize, before I could even register the movement of her arm, she raised her hand and slapped me across the face with all her strength. Crack! The sound echoed sharply over the upbeat pop music playing from the outdoor patio speakers. The immediate, high-pitched ringing started in my left ear. The hot, spreading fire exploded across my cheekbone. My head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. The entire backyard went instantly, horrifyingly silent. The splash of the pool stopped. The guy flipping burgers at the grill froze like a statue, his metal tongs held midair. Mrs. Gable, standing on her wooden porch holding a tray of hot dogs, stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth falling open. I stood there, frozen. My knuckles turned white around the plastic tube of sunscreen. The blood rushed to my face. I slowly turned my head back to look at my wife. Mora realized immediately, in the suffocating silence of the yard, what she had just done in front of 30 witnesses. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing an ounce of shame, she laughed. A loud, fake, shrill, terrifyingly manic laugh. Oh my God, Torin, there was a huge horsefly on your cheek, she yelled loudly to the staring crowd, waving her hand in the air as if shooing a bug. I got it. Wow, that thing was massive. You're welcome, babe. Nobody laughed with her, not even Chloe. The silence was deafening. She leaned in close to me, the smell of tequila heavy on her breath. Her fake smile remained plastered on her face, but her voice dropped to a vicious, venomous whisper that only I could hear. Don't you ever, ever embarrass me in front of people again, you clumsy idiot. I didn't say a single word. My cheek throbbed with a burning, rhythmic pulse. I looked at her, truly seeing the monster beneath the skin. I turned, walked over to the grass, picked up my confused son, and walked home in total silence. I was getting screwed so hard I should have checked my own skin for splinters. But I still thought, naively, desperately, for Leo's sake, that we could fix the broken foundation of our family. That night, I suggested couples counseling. I begged her to try. She laughed in my face, told me to go to therapy by myself to fix my inadequacies, and locked the bedroom door. Beat 5 was the destruction of my work, the sabotage. It happened 2 weeks after the barbecue. I had spent 40 grueling hours restoring a gorgeous 1920s burled walnut humidor for a wealthy client. It was a delicate, intricate piece of woodwork. I had brought it up from the freezing garage and placed it carefully on the far corner of the kitchen island to apply the final, delicate coat of French polish, because the lighting was better and the air was less dusty. I applied the polish, marveling at the rich, intoxicating aroma of the aged walnut coming back to life. I stepped away for exactly 30 seconds to grab a clean microfiber rag from the laundry room. Crash. The sound of shattering wood and breaking glass echoed through the house. I sprinted back into the kitchen. The humidor was on the ceramic tile floor, smashed into 5 jagged, splintered pieces. The antique glass top was dust. Maura was standing at the island, holding an apple. She looked down at the wreckage. "What happened?" I yelled, dropping to my knees, my hands hovering over the ruined hours of my life. "It was in my way," she said casually, taking a loud bite of her apple. "I was trying to reach the cutting board and it just slipped." "The cutting board is on the entirely opposite counter, Maura," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You pushed it. You shoved it off the edge." She looked down at me, her eyes flashing with cold defiance. "Are you calling me a liar over a stupid wooden box, Torin?" "It's a commissioned piece," I whispered, holding a piece of splintered walnut. "It took me 3 weeks of my life." "Then you shouldn't leave your garbage where people live," she sneered. "This is a kitchen, not your pathetic little workshop. Clean it up. Someone could step on that glass." I absorbed the loss. I swept up the glass. I hid the violent rage burning in my chest, burying it deep down where she couldn't see it. Beat 6 was the spatial violation, the true invasion of my home. A week later, I came home from picking up lumber to find a strange, aggressively shiny car parked crookedly in my driveway. A sleek, black Audi sports sedan. I walked through the front door, the hairs on the back of my arms standing up. I walked into my living room, and there was a man sitting right in the middle of my house. He was lounging casually in my favorite armchair, my grandfather's armchair, the one I had painstakingly, lovingly reupholstered by hand over the course of a month. He was wearing a tight, branded polo shirt that showed off his gym muscles, heavily slicked back dark hair, and a bulky gold watch that cost more than my entire truck. And the moment I stepped into the room, I was hit by a suffocating wave of a scent I knew intimately. He smelled exactly like the cheap, sharp, metallic cologne I'd been smelling in Maura's car for months. Maura walked confidently out of the kitchen, carrying 2 cold, sweating bottles of beer, my imported beers, from the back of the fridge. "Oh, Torin, you're home early," she said smoothly, not a hint of panic in her voice. "This is Declan. He's a new top-tier agent at the brokerage. We're just going over some complex commercial contracts." Declan didn't even bother to stand up to shake my hand. He just sat back in my grandfather's chair, smirked, took the beer from my wife, and gave me a lazy, disrespectful nod. "Hey, man," Declan said, his voice dripping with arrogant condescension. "Nice place you got here. A little rustic, a little small, but nice." He had the kind of smug, unpunchable face you just wanted to hit with a heavy iron shovel. Twice. The violent, primal urge to walk across the room, grab him by the collar of his expensive shirt, and drag him out onto the concrete driveway was so strong it made my vision blur. I swallowed it down. "Contracts," I said, my voice deadpan, betraying absolutely zero emotion. "Yeah," Mora said, stepping slightly in front of him, adopting a defensive, protective stance over another man in my own house. "We're going to be working very closely together on a new development. He might be dropping by a lot to strategize." She was bringing him into my sanctuary, parading her lover right in front of my face, daring me to say something, daring me to react, because she absolutely knew, that if I snapped, if I yelled, if I physically threw him out of the house, she held the ultimate trump card. She could play the victim. She could immediately call the police, cry crocodile tears, and say her unstable, jealous, abusive husband was acting violently toward her colleague. I looked at Declan. I looked at his expensive shoes resting near my rug. I looked at the sweating bottle of beer in his hand, hovering dangerously over the antique wood of the side table. "Use a coaster," I said softly. I turned around, walked up the stairs, and locked myself in the bathroom until my hands stopped shaking. Beat 7 came directly from Chloe, the mouthpiece. Chloe was Mora's chief enabler, her cheerleader, her toxic soundboard. Chloe had the depth and personality of a wet paper towel, but with twice the venom. She was always at our house, drinking our expensive wine, whispering furiously with Mora on the couch, and glaring at me when I walked past. A few days after the Declan incident, Chloe cornered me in the kitchen. Mora was upstairs, taking an hour to get ready for another ambiguous girls' night out. I was pouring myself a cup of coffee, trying to ignore her. "You know, you're really suffocating her," Chloe said suddenly. I turned to see her leaning heavily against the granite counter, inspecting her long, painted nails. The cloying, overly sweet scent of her vanilla perfume filled the kitchen. I stopped pouring. The hot coffee steamed in the mug. "Excuse me?" "Mora," Chloe said, looking up at me with a condescending pity that made my skin crawl. "She's a vibrant, high-value woman, Torin. She needs excitement. She needs a certain lifestyle, and you're so incredibly boring. You just work in the dirt and take care of the kid. You should be down on your knees grateful she even stays in this house with you. Most women of her caliber would have left a guy who makes as little money as you do a long, long time ago." I stared at her, taking slow, deliberate breaths to keep my heart rate down. "Does she tell you everything about our marriage, Chloe?" "She tells me enough," Chloe smirked, tapping her nails against the granite with a sharp click, click, click. "I know all about Declan. He's a real man. He treats her the way she deserves to be treated. You should probably just do the dignified thing and step aside before she has to forcefully evict you from her life." "Thanks for the advice, Chloe," I said quietly, taking my mug and walking away. Beat 8 was the institutional threat. The moment she finally showed me her jagged teeth and the true depth of her malice. It happened 2 weeks later, in late October. The house was freezing. We were standing in the living room, arguing intensely about money. I had been going through the mail and found a strange, massive charge on our joint checking account statement. A massive, inexplicable withdrawal of funds. "Where exactly did this money go?" I asked, holding the crisp bank statement up, my hand trembling slightly. Mora crossed her arms defensively, leaning back against the couch. "I invested it into my personal brand." "You took out a massive line of credit against our joint marital assets," I said, my voice finally rising above its normal, quiet hum. "Mora, this is a withdrawal for $68,200. What the hell did you do with $68,000? She uncrossed her arms and stepped close to me, invading my space, her dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. I spent it on things I deserve, Torin, because you are entirely incapable of providing them for me. The icy drop in my chest was sudden and profound, as if my heart had plummeted directly into my stomach. I'm calling the bank right now. I'm reporting this entire line of credit as fraud. That was the exact moment she smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was a cold, terrifying, predatory baring of teeth. You go right ahead and do that, Torin, she whispered, her voice laced with lethal poison. You make that call, and I will file for a brutal, at-fault divorce tomorrow morning. I will take Leo. I will sit in front of a family court judge, and I will cry, and I will tell them you have been physically abusive to me for years. I will tell them you drink heavily in your garage. I have dozens of photos of the dark purple bruises on my arms and thighs from my advanced kickboxing class, and I will swear under oath that you gave them to me. My blood went instantly, horrifyingly cold. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. You will never, ever see that boy again, she continued, stepping even closer, her breath hitting my chin. And because your legal name is attached to that joint credit line, you will be working in your pathetic little wood shop paying off that $68,000 for the next 10 years while I live comfortably in a new house that you pay alimony for. So go ahead, call the bank. She had mapped it all out. She had built a cage around me while I was sleeping. She had trapped me. You wouldn't use Leo like a pawn, I said, my voice barely a dry rasp in my throat. You're his mother. Try me. She smiled brightly, patting my cheek condescendingly. Watch me. And then came beat 9, the cruelest moment, the one that finally, permanently severed the last remaining thread of my mercy and my humanity regarding her. It was mid-November. The temperature had plummeted, and the first major snowstorm of the year was coming down hard in Denver, blanketing the streets in heavy, wet white. Leo woke up screaming at 2 a.m. I rushed into his room. He was burning up. His little body was radiating heat like a furnace. The thermometer read a fever of 103.4 degrees. He was entirely lethargic, his eyes rolling back slightly, violently throwing up everything in his stomach, shivering uncontrollably in his sweat-soaked pajamas. Maura wasn't home. She had told me she was attending a mandatory weekend-long real estate networking conference down in Colorado Springs. I wrapped Leo in a heavy blanket, carried him out into the blinding snowstorm, strapped him into my freezing truck, and drove recklessly through the unplowed streets to the pediatric emergency room. I spent the entire agonizing night in the harsh, fluorescent glare of the ER. I was terrified out of my mind. The room smelled of harsh bleach and rubbing alcohol. He looked so incredibly small and fragile, shivering in his oversized, faded hospital gown, hooked up to an IV drip pumping fluids and antibiotics into his tiny arm. I sat in the hard plastic chair beside his bed, holding his hot, limp hand. I pulled out my phone and called Maura. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I called her 22 separate times between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. Every single call was ignored. At 6:30 a.m., the exhausted attending doctor finally came in, checked the monitors, and told me they had stabilized his temperature. It was a severe, acute viral infection. He was out of the woods. We could finally go home. When I carried my utterly exhausted, sleeping son through our front door at 8 a.m., the house smelled of stale coffee. Maura was sitting casually at the kitchen island, drinking from a mug, scrolling through Instagram. "Where the hell have you been?" she snapped aggressively the second I walked in. I got home an hour ago and the house is an absolute disaster. There are crusted dishes in the sink, Torin. You didn't even run the dishwasher. I stopped in my tracks. I just stared at her. She was wearing the exact same clothes she had left the house in 2 days ago. Her hair was messy, and as the air in the kitchen circulated, she smelled, unmistakably, overwhelmingly, like Declan's cheap, metallic cologne. Leo was in the hospital all night, I said, my voice entirely hollow, devoid of any inflection. He had a 103-degree fever. He was throwing up. She waved her hand dismissively in the air, not even looking at the sleeping boy in my arms. Oh, please. Kids get fevers all the time. You always overreact to every little sniffle. You're so incredibly dramatic. God, I can't even come home from a massively stressful work trip without you immediately trying to make me feel guilty for existing. She didn't ask how he was doing. She didn't get up from her stool to check his forehead. She didn't try to hold him. She complained about the unwashed dishes. Beat 10 wasn't a violent explosion. It wasn't a shouting match. It was a quiet, profound, internal click inside my brain. The heavy, metallic sound of a bank vault locking shut forever. I walked heavily up the stairs, carried Leo into his room, gently laid him down in his crib, and pulled his favorite fleece blanket up to his chin. I leaned down and kissed his damp forehead. Then, I walked softly down the hall and into Maura's master bathroom to retrieve the children's liquid Tylenol from the medicine cabinet. Her leather overnight bag was sitting on the bathroom tiles, unzipped and overflowing with clothes. Sticking halfway out of the small side zipper pocket was a folded piece of thick, glossy paper. I reached down and pulled it out. The paper crinkled softly in the quiet bathroom. It was an itemized hotel folio receipt. It wasn't from a conference center in Colorado Springs. It was from the Crawford, a massive, ultra-luxury boutique hotel located downtown, exactly 10 minutes away from our house. It was billed for 2 nights in a penthouse suite. The primary guest names printed clearly at the top were Maura Caldwell and Declan Vance. Room service charges for champagne and strawberries were highlighted, and the credit card used to pay the massive $1,200 bill. The receipt listed the last 4 digits. It was the joint line of credit she had fraudulently opened in my name. The $68,200 pool of money she was actively draining to fund her affair. I stood there in the bathroom. The absolute terrifying stillness settled over my mind. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't confront her. I just carefully folded the receipt, slid it silently into the front pocket of my jeans, grabbed the Tylenol, and walked back downstairs to wash her dishes. I had been waiting patiently for the storm to pass over my house, but standing in that hallway, looking at the receipt, I realized the storm wasn't ever going to pass. It was going to drown me. If I wanted to survive, I had to become the storm. What Maura didn't know, what Chloe didn't know, what absolutely nobody in her arrogant, toxic orbit knew, was that I had been meticulously, silently building an airtight legal case against her for 3 solid months before that freezing night in the kitchen. Remember the time I told you my superpower was noticing small things? Remember my grandfather's quote? "A quiet dog remembers his scent, tracks him to his den, and ends the problem." I hadn't just been taking her horrific abuse silently because I was a weak, spineless coward. I was taking it silently because every single time she started screaming at me, every time she backed me into a corner and made a threat, my hand was casually in my pocket, and my phone was recording. Colorado is a one-party consent state for the recording of private conversations. I had looked up the penal code. I knew the law intimately. She didn't. I had 42 separate high-quality audio files uploaded to a secure cloud server. I had crystal clear recordings of her screaming at me, I had her loudly admitting to fraudulently opening the massive credit line without my permission. I had her explicitly threatening to fake physical abuse injuries to extort me in court. I had hours of her verbally degrading me, proving a documented pattern of severe emotional abuse. But I am a thorough man. I needed more. I needed undeniable visual proof of the affair and a concrete paper trail of the financial fraud so absolutely airtight and devastating that no family court judge in the state would ever grant her custody of Leo or force me to pay her debts. That was where my secret, unexpected ally came into play. Mrs. Gable, the sweet, observant neighbor who had watched Maura slap me at the 4th of July barbecue. A week after the humiliating slap, Mrs. Gable had walked to the edge of her property line and waved me over to her porch while I was pushing the humming lawnmower across the grass. The summer afternoon was heavy with oppressive humidity. She handed me a sweating glass of sweet iced tea. As I reached for it, she pressed a small, heavy, silver USB drive into my calloused palm. "Torrin, honey," Mrs. Gable had said quietly, her kind eyes looking incredibly sad but razor sharp. "My husband was a homicide detective for 30 years in this city. He doesn't miss a trick, and neither do I. We have high-definition, motion-activated security cameras pointing directly at the street and your driveway. I see exactly what time you leave in your rattling truck for the antique shop. And I see exactly who pulls into your driveway 10 minutes later in a black Audi, and exactly how many hours he stays inside your house with your wife." I looked down at the silver drive resting in my palm. The weight of it felt like an anvil. "Mrs. Gable, I don't know what to say." "You don't say anything," she said firmly, patting my hand. "You take that. You take care of that sweet little boy, and you burn her to the ground." The USB drive contained 60 days of time-stamped, high-definition video footage. Declan's black Audi pulling up. Maura greeting him passionately at the front door, wearing nothing but a silk bathrobe. Declan leaving 4 hours later, tucking his shirt in. Every single time I was at work, I had the audio recordings, I had the video surveillance, I had the stack of hotel receipts I had quietly, systematically photographed from her purse over the weeks while she slept. I had the bank statements proving the $68,200 had gone exclusively to designer clothes, luxury hotels, and a $15,000 down payment on a new sports car for Declan. I took all of it, neatly organized in a heavy black binder, to Harriet. Harriet was an elite family law attorney who looked exactly like a sweet, harmless grandmother who knitted sweaters but operated in a courtroom like a starving white shark. When I sat in the leather chair in her polished office, smelling the lemon polish and old paper, and played her the audio recordings of the extortion threats, Harriet didn't even blink. She just calmly wrote notes on her yellow legal pad, the scratching of her pen the only sound in the room. "She thinks I'm a pushover, Harriet," I told her, staring at the wall. "She thinks I'm weak. She thinks I'll just surrender the house and the boy to avoid a fight. We are going to let her continue to think exactly that, Torrin," Harriet said, tapping her pen against the desk, "right up until the exact moment we drop the guillotine on her neck." The master plan was set. I was going to serve her with a devastating divorce petition that would leave her entirely with nothing. I was going to take full, sole custody of Leo because of her documented neglect and criminal extortion threats. And then, exactly 2 weeks before we were supposed to spring the trap, I got the email. The entirely unrelated DNA test for the leukemia bone marrow registry. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. That brings us right back to the beginning, to the freezing kitchen. To Maura digging her sharp crimson nails into my chest, screaming in my face that if I ever touched her phone again, she would call the cops and say I beat her. She thought I was confronting her about the text message from Declan I had seen pop up on the island. I looked down at her aggressive hand pressing into my chest. I looked at the crumpled DNA paper hidden in my fist. If Leo wasn't mine, then Mora's betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was 3 years deeper, 3 years darker than I ever could have imagined. She had looked me in the eyes and lied to me every single day since the moment I held that tiny boy in the hospital room. She had let me fall entirely, irreversibly in love with another man's child, just so she could have a babysitter and a bankroll while she lived her life. "Are you even listening to me, you pathetic loser?" she screamed, shoving me hard against the counter, her face flushed red with rage. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I channeled every single ounce of patience I had ever learned from sanding 100-year-old wood. I forced my heart rate to slow down. "I'm listening," I said calmly, opening my eyes. My voice was a dead, flat monotone. I took a deliberate step back, removing myself from her physical reach. "I won't touch your phone again, Mora. I'm sorry. Go back to sleep." She sneered at me, a look of absolute, unfiltered disgust twisting her features. "You are so entirely pathetic," she muttered, grabbing her phone from the counter and stomping heavily up the wooden stairs. I stood alone in the dark, freezing kitchen. I walked over to the counter. I slowly flattened the crumpled DNA results against the granite. I stared at the stark black numbers printed on the white page. My heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces for myself, but mostly for Leo. He was my son. Biological blood didn't matter to me. It never would. I had rocked him to sleep. I had fed him. I had taught him how to walk. I loved him. I wasn't going to let a soulless monster raise him, and I certainly wasn't going to hand him over to Declan. I was going to take him with me, no matter what it cost. I pulled my phone out and called Harriet at 7 a.m. the next morning. "Harriet," I said, my voice rough, "I need to add something massive to the binder." The reversal happened exactly 14 days later. Mora, growing arrogant and impatient, had demanded a formal, sit-down meeting at a lawyer's office to discuss our marital assets. She had finally decided to initiate her threat. She wanted me to sign a legally binding post-nuptial agreement admitting fault to the $68,200 debt and formally agreeing to give her primary physical custody of Leo. Or she would march straight to the police precinct with her fake abuse photos. She chose a ridiculously fancy, glass-walled conference room in a high-rise building in downtown Denver. The room was freezing cold, the air conditioning blasting. I walked in at exactly 10 a.m. Harriet was already sitting next to me at the massive mahogany table, her leather briefcase closed, her hands folded neatly. Mora walked in 10 minutes late, an intentional power play. She was wearing a sharp, tailored white pantsuit, her hair perfectly blown out, smelling strongly of her expensive floral perfume. She looked like she was headed to a victory parade, and she brought Chloe with her. "Chloe is here for my emotional support," Mora announced arrogantly, pulling out a squeaking leather chair across from me and crossing her legs. She didn't even bother to look at me. She addressed Harriet directly, her tone dripping with boredom. "Let's make this quick, Counsel. Torin has already agreed to my terms. He's signing the debt assumption paperwork and the primary custody arrangement today." "Where do we sign?" Harriet slowly adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses, looking at Mora like she was a fascinating bug under a microscope. "Mr. Caldwell has agreed to absolutely no such thing, ma'am." Mora rolled her eyes dramatically, leaning back in her chair. "Torin, tell your little attack dog to stand down and process the paperwork. Do you want me to make the phone call right now? Because I will. I have the photos of the bruises you gave me on my phone. We discussed what happens if you fight me." I just sat there. My hands were folded quietly on the cool glass of the table. I remained utterly, completely silent. My client doesn't need to speak to you, Harriet said smoothly. She reached down into her leather briefcase. She pulled out the thick, heavy black binder. Thud. It hit the mahogany table with the sound of a judge's gavel. What the hell is that? Chloe scoffed, leaning forward. His dusty little antique catalogs? This, Harriet said, her voice dropping an octave, flipping the heavy cover open, is a comprehensive, legally admissible log of chronic financial fraud, marital infidelity, and felony extortion. Harriet seamlessly slid the first thick stack of documents across the smooth glass table. It was the bank tracing of the $68,200. Exhibit A, Harriet said crisply. Extensive documentation, subpoenaed directly from the bank, proving Mrs. Caldwell fraudulently opened a massive line of credit in my client's name without his consent and utilized the stolen funds exclusively for personal luxury expenses. This includes $12,000 in hotel rooms at the Crawford, shared intimately with a Mr. Declan Vance. Mora's smug, arrogant smile instantly froze. It didn't fade. It just rigidly stopped. Her dark eyes darted down to the highlighted paper. That's a business expense, Mora stammered, her voice suddenly losing its power. Declan is a colleague. Harriet didn't pause. She reached into the binder and slid a small silver flash drive across the table. It clattered against the glass. Exhibit B, Harriet continued relentlessly. 60 consecutive days of high-definition security footage legally obtained from a neighboring property, showing Mr. Vance entering the marital home while my client was at work and remaining inside for hours at a time while Mrs. Caldwell was in various states of undress. Chloe shifted violently in her leather chair, suddenly looking very pale and very uncomfortable. Mora, Chloe whispered. What is she talking about? Mora swallowed hard. I could see the pulse jumping erratically in her neck. Torin, you're spying on me? You put cameras on me? That's illegal. You're completely crazy. Exhibit C, Harriet said, her voice like liquid nitrogen, sliding a thick, printed transcript across the table. 42 separate, legally obtained, one-party consent audio recordings of Mrs. Caldwell explicitly threatening to falsify domestic abuse charges to the police in order to extort my client into assuming her fraudulent bank debt. Mora's face went completely, shockingly white. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she looked physically ill. A sheen of cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Her hands, resting on the table, began to shake violently. You recorded me? She whispered, her voice cracking. She stared at me, sheer terror finally breaking through her mask. In our house? I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I just watched her drown. The financial fraud alone carries a potential multi-year prison sentence in the state of Colorado, Harriet noted casually, as if discussing the weather. The extortion is a separate, entirely distinct felony charge. We have prepared a final divorce settlement today. In this settlement, my client assumes absolutely 0% of the debt, retains 100% equity in the marital home, and is granted sole legal and physical custody of the minor child, Leo, with strictly supervised visitation for you. You can't take my son? Mora shrieked, suddenly slamming both of her shaking hands onto the glass table, the carefully constructed mask finally, completely slipping away. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air. He's my blood. No judge in this state will ever take a child from his biological mother. I'll fight you. I'll tell the judge you're not even his real father. You have no biological rights to him. The entire conference room went dead, suffocatingly silent. Chloe gasped loudly, slapping a hand over her mouth, staring at Mora in absolute horror. Mora froze, her eyes widening as she realized exactly what she had just screamed at the top of her lungs in a room full of lawyers. She had kept that monstrous secret hidden in the dark for 3 entire years. In her blind, desperate panic to hurt me, she had weaponized it, pulling the pin on a grenade she didn't realize she was still holding. She didn't know I already knew. Harriet didn't even flinch. She didn't show a single ounce of surprise. She just reached into the back pocket of the black binder one final time. She pulled out a single, pristine piece of white paper. The genetic lab results. Harriet slid it slowly across the glass table. It made a soft, whispering sound. It came to a stop exactly 2 inches from Mora's violently shaking hands. "Exhibit D," Harriet said softly, twisting the knife. "The DNA paternity test results my client received 2 weeks ago. You are entirely correct, Mrs. Caldwell. Torin is not the biological father." Mora stared down at the paper. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like all the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. However, Harriet continued, her voice ringing with absolute, crushing authority. "Under Colorado family law, because my client is listed on the original birth certificate and has acted exclusively as the psychological and financial father for the child's entire life, he retains full parental rights. Furthermore, given your extensively documented neglect, your felony extortion, and the fact that you just loudly admitted to intentional paternity fraud on the record, the family court judge will not view your character favorably. Sign the surrender paperwork, Mora, or I call the police regarding the fraud right now." Mora looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, panicked, pleading, spilling over with thick black mascara tears. The arrogant, untouchable, electric woman from the Colfax coffee shop was entirely gone. In her place was just a terrified, cornered animal who had finally been caught in her own trap. "Torin," she whispered, her voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "Please, I'm so sorry. I was lost. I was confused. Declan means absolutely nothing to me. It was a mistake. Please, Torin, don't do this. Don't take everything from me. I have nothing." I sat in my chair. I looked at the woman who had slapped me across the face in front of my neighbors. The woman who had callously locked my grandfather's irreplaceable tools in a flooded, rotting basement. The woman who had left my terrified son screaming in his own filth while she drank wine and texted her lover. I stood up slowly. The leather chair squeaked behind me. I calmly buttoned my suit jacket. "You can keep Declan," I said, my voice perfectly quiet, echoing in the cold room. "And you can keep the dead." I turned and walked out of the heavy glass doors. Exactly 10 words. I left her violently sobbing, her head buried in her arms on the mahogany table, while Chloe quickly pushed her chair back and physically distanced herself from the blast radius of her ruined friend. The cascade of ruin happened much faster than I ever expected. Within 2 weeks of the meeting, Declan found out through the lawyers that Mora was being entirely stripped of her marital assets and was about to be hit with $68,200 in toxic bank debt that she was solely, legally responsible for. He dumped her via a brutal, 2-line text message and immediately transferred to a brokerage branch in Arizona to avoid the fallout. Within a month, Chloe and the rest of her superficial friend group entirely abandoned her. Nobody wants to be socially associated with a toxic woman caught on tape threatening to fake domestic abuse. The security footage of the affair and the audio recordings somehow became the worst-kept secret circulating in her luxury real estate brokerage. She was quietly, firmly asked by the partners to resign her position to avoid a massive public relations scandal. The final, pathetic contact attempt came 2 months later. I was at the house. I had just finished rolling the final coat of fresh, zero VOC blue latex paint onto the walls of Leo's new bedroom. The divorce was officially finalized by the judge because Maura was facing terrifying potential criminal charges for the credit fraud. Harriet had easily negotiated a brutal, unconditional surrender. Maura signed over all rights and equity to the house, took the entirety of the debt, and gave me full, primary physical and legal custody of Leo. She only asked for every other weekend visitation. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I wiped the blue paint from my hands with a rag and answered it. It was Maura. "Torin," she said. Her voice sounded raspy, tinny, and incredibly small through the speaker. "I can't take Leo this weekend for my visitation. I'm moving into a smaller, cheaper apartment across town. I just, I can't handle a screaming toddler right now. My life is completely falling apart." "I know," I said calmly, looking at the fresh paint. "Are you happy?" she asked, a sudden, bitter, venomous edge creeping back into her exhausted voice. "Are you happy that you completely destroyed me? Are you proud of yourself?" "I didn't destroy you, Maura," I said, walking to the window and looking out at the sprawling, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. The profound, weightless sensation of freedom settled deep in my chest. "I just stopped standing in the way of you destroying yourself." I hung up the phone. I opened my settings and permanently blocked her number. She hasn't called to ask to see Leo since that day. I think, deep down in her hollow core, she never actually wanted to be a mother. She just wanted a cute prop for her life. And when the prop became too inconvenient and the bankroll dried up, she simply walked away. I immediately went through the complex legal process to formally, permanently adopt him, sealing my parental rights in stone forever. He is a Caldwell. He always will be. Today is a quiet Sunday. I'm sitting out on my back porch. I have a heavy ceramic mug of bitter black coffee resting in my calloused hand. The Denver morning air is incredibly crisp, biting my cheeks, smelling sharply of pine needles and upcoming snow. Through the thick glass of the sliding door, I can hear the chaotic, colorful sounds of Saturday morning cartoons playing on the television. Leo is sitting happily on the soft living room rug, wearing his pajamas. He is playing with a complex wooden train set I hand-carved for him out of scrap mahogany from the shop. He's safe. He's happy. He hasn't cried himself to sleep in months. I look down at my resting hands. They are heavily calloused, permanently stained with dark wood finish, bearing the tiny, fading white scars of 1,000 slips of the steel chisel. My grandfather was absolutely right. A loud dog barks at the thief, makes a lot of noise, and scares him back into the woods. But a quiet dog remembers his scent. I remembered. I endured. I waited in the absolute silence. And when the perfect time finally came, I didn't just bite. I took back exactly what was mine, and I let the rest of it burn to the ground.